Welcome to Co-Creating Heaven on Earth, a gathering of today's leading visionaries sharing practical strategies for creating a world that works for all. Share this powerful event with your friends and family and join in our conversation on Facebook at the Shift Network. And now your host, Martin Root.
Welcome, everyone. This is Martin Root. We're so glad you're joining us. I'm very excited to introduce our special guest for this session, Richard Barrett. And I don't even know what to say about Richard, an old dear friend. Richard used to work for the World Bank and then got enthused with values, and I think is one of the leading experts in values in the world today. As I was preparing for this session, I came up with this name, Mr. Values. So that's my new name for him. And the reason I wanted Richard in this telesummit on Heaven on Earth is because one of the gateways for me into Heaven on Earth is living your values. Values you live your own life by, values you'd like to see lived in the world, in your organization, in your relationship. Values infuse and inform us in a great many ways. They're kind of touchstones. And Richard's work has really gone deeply, deeply into values and the connection with soul and Heaven on Earth. So, first of all, welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Martin.
And folks, you have to understand that Richard and I go way back, and that if we were really supposed to do this interview the way we were supposed to, it would be 45 minutes of pure laughter. But, you know, you got to put content in anyway. Richard, in your new book, A New Psychology of Human Well-Being, you make a statement which I really liked. The soul's purpose in incarnating, that is, willing itself to be present in the three-dimensional material awareness, is to recreate its four-dimensional energetic reality in 3D material awareness. This is sometimes referred to in religious circles as creating heaven on earth. So I thought that was a wonderful way to start our interview. And I want to begin with, because I know you connect values and soul and ego. So let's start at basic. What are values?
Well, you could say, and I used to say this, that they're a shorthand expression of what's important to us. And then I realized, actually, they're the energetic drivers of our aspirations and intentions. They're energetic drivers. When you get people to sit around and talk about their values, an amazing thing happens. The whole energy level goes up. And the reason the energy level goes up because we are very deeply connected to our values. And I'll tell you why that is in a minute. But first, let me give you a chance to speak, Martin.
And say what, Richard? You're on a roll there. I'm completely entranced. The energetic drivers, which I love, and you know, it's like you were saying, they're deep, they're drivers. And so what is that? What's that mechanism? What's that energetic?
Okay, so thank you for that question. Here we go. So the values are the energetic drivers of our aspirations and intentions. And so the question now is, well, what are values? Values are an expression of our needs. Whatever we need, we value. And whatever we feel is important in our lives, we value. So there's a link between values and needs. Now, if you look at a human being over the full span of their life, they go through 7 stages of development. I call it 7 stages of psychological development. And they play out this ego-soul dynamic. The ego learns to grow and develop during the first 3 stages, and the soul gets activated in the last 3 stages. And in the middle stage, this is the individuating stage where we learn to align the beliefs of the ego with the values of the soul. And so values, these higher order values, which we call virtues, are actually a measure of the culture of the soul. Well, what do I mean by that? the culture of humanity, because the soul is an individuated aspect of the universal energy field. So when we get into these higher stages of psychological development, we're tapping into what is common to all of us. And when we tap into what is common to all of us, we find these virtues, values, which express the soul's needs. And those soul's needs are three, basically, to fully express who we are, or the soul fully expresses who it is. The soul connects with people in unconditional loving relationship, and then the soul wants to contribute to the good of humanity. And when you can fulfill those three requirements, that, for me, is when you're living heaven on earth, because you don't have any needs anymore. All your needs are met by your soul before you even know you have them.
There's a lot in what you just said, so let's break it out a little bit. First of all, I was struck by the phrase ego-soul dynamic, and it sounds like the 7 stages of development, the 7 levels rather, of values development, moves someone from their ego into their soul and out into the world. First of all, is that accurate?
Correct. And so let me just quickly anticipate your question and talk you through the soul journey, because when the soul incarnates into the human embryo, for the first 10 weeks, there is no, the embryo has no mind, because the reptilian mind brain is forming. So the embryo is pure soul consciousness. Then the reptilian mind brain forms after 10 weeks of gestation and takes over looks after the operation of the body, keeps the fetus alive. We shift from embryo to fetus after about 10 weeks when the reptilian mind brain forms. And so the job of we haven't yet got to the ego. I'll get there in a moment. So from that moment through birth, up to about the age of 18 months or 2 years, the reptilian mind brain, which is focused on one thing, that's physiological survival, is the dominant mind brain. And the soul, as soon as the reptilian mind brain form, gets pushed into the subconscious awareness. So we start at the embryo stage with full soul awareness. The soul then becomes a subconscious of the reptilian mind brain, or the body mind. Then around 2, the limbic mind brain becomes dominant, and that's the emotional mind. The body mind now becomes the subconscious. The soul mind now becomes the unconscious. Then around the age of 8, the neocortex becomes dominant. The emotional mind becomes the subconscious, the body mind becomes the unconscious, and now the soul mind is the super unconscious. So by the time we've got to the end of our childhood and our teenage years, the soul is pushed way back into the background. Now, what happens, this is where the ego gets formed, about 18 months, the soul experiences three-dimensional awareness through a lack of love, the pain of separation. When the baby begins to recognize that it isn't living in a unified world, but there are other people out there, this means for the soul separation. Now the soul lives in this total connectedness, and so separation for the soul is very painful. Also, any experiences of the body mind where there is pain in the body are experienced by the soul as, again, lack of love. And so around 18 months, generally, the pain of being in three-dimensional awareness of that the soul is experiencing becomes so large that it creates the psychic entity we call the ego, which is there acting as a buffer to prevent the soul from feeling any more pain. And so the ego then begins to grow and develop. Now, the ego has this big idea that it has to survive and stay safe and feel secure. So where does that idea come from? In fact, this idea of survival is even in the body mind, and it's even in everything natural in the world that is alive. There's this need to survive. And you can look in all the scientific textbooks and biological textbooks you like, and you will not find anywhere an explanation of where the will to survive comes from. Well, actually, the will to survive is simply the soul's will to be present in three-dimensional material awareness. And the ego takes that on as a fundamentally important facet of who it is. And so the ego's focus on survival for the first 2 years, safety when it's being loved and a young child, and security when it becomes a teenager and young adult. And it develops beliefs about how to meet those needs. And so that's how the ego forms. That's where the ego comes from. And at the individuating stage, when we get into our late 20s and early 30s, the ego now begins to let go of the beliefs it learned in order to fit into the cultural framework of existence and get its needs met, begins to let go of that, become a viable independent entity. And from that point on, now there is an opening for the soul activation to take place in the 40s and thereafter.
Brilliant, really, really. And so the value system that you've created, the 7 levels, takes people's awareness of themselves and others and larger organizational systems and says, this is where that person, that entity is, and this is how you can move it up the scale toward more soul consciousness and away from ego, not away from ego, but away from ego consciousness.
Well, away from the ego fears, I think that's the important thing. So yes, we can, so when we first met, going back, Martin, to around 1992, 93, 94, 95, I was working on developing the 7 levels model and the measuring system that goes with that, so that, because you see, any value you care to name belongs to a level of consciousness. Now, and you can go online and you can do a free values assessment, and maybe we'll give that out to people so they can find out where they are in, based on their values in terms of the 7 levels. But the important thing to remember is this, that we grow in stages of psychological development and we operate at levels of consciousness. So that I may be in my early 30s at the individuating stage, the 4th stage of psychological development. I lose all my money, I lose my job, and there's an economic downturn. And now I start operating from the survival level of consciousness. So I was at the individuating stage of development. I moved down to the survival level of consciousness. That doesn't mean to say I go back to being a baby. It just means I go back to that level of consciousness where survival is important. So we grow in stages and we operate at levels.
Can you give us the 7 levels one by one, but really, really simple, like a title for each level, and then we'll go into some of what the values are within each one. But I want people to just get a structural overview first.
Yeah. Okay. So I already given you a rough outline of the stages of development. Let me now talk about the levels of consciousness. What values belong to what levels of consciousness? So if you're in survival mode, that's the first level of consciousness, survival. So from a personal point of view, we've got 7 levels of personal consciousness, 7 levels of organizational consciousness, 7 levels of national consciousness. In fact, we mapped the nation, the values of 26 nations now, but I'm just going to talk about the 7 levels of personal consciousness. So at the survival level of consciousness, guess what? I mean, it's financial security, it's health, it's nutrition. These are things that we value at that level of consciousness. At the 2nd level, which is relationships, we value open communication, we value friendship, we value loyalty. At the self-esteem level, we value responsibility, excellence, achievement, and things of this nature. Now, these first 3 levels are all about the things that our ego needs, ego values. And so there are positive values here, but there are also potentially limiting values. Let me give you an example. Blame is a limiting relationship value. blame is to do with relationships, and I call it a value because if it wasn't valuable to you, to the ego, then you wouldn't blame other people. But blame is really a limiting value because what it's trying to do is you're trying to redirect the wrath of somebody towards somebody else for something that you did wrong. And so what's really happening there is the ego is wanting to be loved, but it's blaming other people for things that it did in order to be loved. So that's why it's a relationship level limiting value. Similarly, there are limiting values at the self-esteem level and also at the survival level. So at the survival level, we may manipulate people in order to get our needs met. At the self-esteem level, we want to look good. And so in that respect, image is really important. And so then we move to the fourth level of consciousness, I call it the transformation level, which coincides with the individuating stage of development. And that's all about accountability, courage, wanting to explore who you are and get to and feel freedom and autonomy to explore who you are. At the fifth level, which is the self-actualizing stage of development, I call it the internal cohesion level of consciousness. What we're really looking for at this level is to find meaning and purpose in our lives. And what's important to us there is creativity, trust, openness. All of these are values that create internal cohesion. And this is the first level in stages of soul activation. And then the sixth level of consciousness is about making a difference. If you found your purpose and meaning at the previous stage, at the fifth, so you want to make a difference in the world because you found your meaning and purpose. And so in order to make a difference, you have to be able to connect and collaborate with other people. So these are other values. So coaching and mentoring, for example, is a value at level 6. And then we move to level 7. Oh, by the way, empathy is also a level 6 value. And then at level 7, we found our purpose. We want to make a difference by connecting. And now it's all about contributing. And so this is the level of compassion, humility, focusing on future generations, etc. And so these are the 7 levels of consciousness. And as I said, the 7 stages, normally speaking, the level of consciousness you operate from will be the same as the stage of development that you've reached. However, if you had those limiting values in the first 3 stages where you formed a belief like, I don't have enough, I'm not loved enough, or I'm not enough, then these subconscious fear-based beliefs will trigger you back into the survival, relationship, and self-esteem levels of consciousness when you come across a situation that reminds you of the situation you experienced in your early years when you didn't get your needs met. So that really is what the 7 levels look like.
Wonderful. Let me just recap. So 1, survival, to 2,
relationship,
to 3, self-esteem, to 4, transformation, to 5, self-actualization.
Or 6, internal cohesion. It's the same thing.
Okay. To 7, making a difference.
6, making a difference. And 7, service.
7, service. And you're saying that applies not only to the individual, but we were also saying earlier, Richard, that it also applies to relationships, organizations, and countries.
It applies to any human group structure you care to name, communities, organizations, nations. So there is a way, you can find sets of values that fit into all of those categories and for all those different group structures. Right.
Have you ever, and so I think I heard you years ago saying you can't move up, if I'm at, say, number 3, I can't move up 2 levels. I can only work on the next until that's integrated. Talk to me then about how do people volitionally move up, or individuals, groups, how do they move up those levels?
Well, let's talk about individuals, and that brings us now back to the stages of psychological development, because the journey of life is the journey of this ego-soul dynamic, where you begin your life in soul consciousness, as I explained earlier. The ego forms, the ego grows and develops, the ego blends with the soul gets activated, and you end your life in soul consciousness. And so each stage of development, you must build a solid foundation of positive values and beliefs. So so each stage then builds on the next. And I love this thing that Maslow says, if you don't feel safe, if you don't have a safe harbor at one level, it's difficult to grow and to the next level, because you won't feel safe going into unknown territory. And so it's really important. It's like a foundation of a building. If you've got a solid survival consciousness, solid relationship consciousness, solid self-esteem consciousness, then that's a brilliant ego foundation for then to blend with the soul and activate the soul. Now, if that foundation is weak, then you keep the limiting beliefs you have keep triggering you to come back into that level. Look, we have a perfect example right now, right in front of us, called Donald Trump. I've analyzed Donald Trump's values because I read his book on leadership, and I found the 10 values that are important to Donald Trump. And unfortunately, Donald Trump had a really, really difficult childhood. At the survival level at the survival stage of development, he never got those basic physiological needs met on time. And at the second stage, the conforming stage, which is the relationship level of consciousness, he didn't feel loved. And at the third stage, the differentiating stage, or the self-esteem level of consciousness, he didn't feel recognized. And so when you read his book on leadership, you'll find these 3 values where he stresses, and in fact, he even writes a chapter about some of them. And so he is very, very, how shall I put it, vengeful. He has a whole chapter on revenge. That's a level 2 limiting value. He throughout the book, you find this notion of what's important to him is image, which is a limiting level 3 value. And you also find he talks a lot about being ruthless, which is a limiting level 1 value. So you see, in that early stage, he really never got his needs fully met in that period 0 to 2, and he developed the beliefs that he had to go out and be ruthless in getting his needs met, because they weren't just met automatically. And at the relationship level, he obviously didn't feel loved, because if you cross him you're in a relation and you cross him, he would be very vengeful, because he's very insecure at that level. And at the self-esteem level, the image level, he never got enough recognition and acknowledgement, so he's always parading his self-image. He has some other values which are quite good, actually, but 2 other values that he talks about. One is winning, and discipline. And when you combine the idea of winning and discipline with ruthlessness, revenge, you're coming up against somebody who is a really tough opponent. And, he's going to get you one way or another. Now, interestingly, at level 4, the transformation level, and when I read his book on leadership, I didn't find a single value that he stressed at that level. So, that's Donald Trump in 7 levels. And, his early childhood, or his childhood and young adulthood, formed him in such a way as to have these limiting values, which you can see fully expressed in nearly everything he does.
Richard, it's interesting to me. I'm just listening to the way you're speaking about him. You're not making him wrong or in any way negativizing what he's doing. What you're just doing is observing and commenting on, this is the way it is. I found that very refreshing, because obviously a lot of people are very negative about him. and some aren't. And if, for me, if we can step back and do that kind of analysis of people, institutions, organizations, it gives us, I'm hearing from you, some opportunity to step in and potentially contribute.
Absolutely. You know, we map the values of individuals and organizations. We map the values of individuals by people going online, picking 10 values, how they operate, and then inviting 15 people they work with to go online and pick 10 values, how they operate. And sometimes, you know, what the other people say about the person, you know, it could be things like demanding, bureaucratic, authoritarian. And so now you come to the point, and the person themselves didn't pick those values. Now you have to give this feedback in a coaching session. And so, you know, you have to be able to say to this person, look, you know, these are the values that you think you have, and they're splendid values and they've helped you, but this is what people see. And how is what these people are seeing in you, how is that helping you get on? And it probably isn't. You know, do you recognize that? So we always have to be very respectful of people's past, and we have to be very respectful for who they are, because often they're not aware of how they are seen and coming across in other people. And that's simply because, you know, they had difficulty getting their survival, relationship, and self-esteem needs in their early lives. In fact, all of the physical and all of the emotional and actually physical problems, or most of them that we have later in life, can be traced back to early childhood and our teenage years.
I mean, that would seem to me a huge opportunity then for society to come in and look after those three initial values being met sufficiently, that we have a stable base upon which to build.
Totally correct. And I would go one stage further. You see, the first stage, the survival stage of development, links to the first stage of soul activation. So level 1 links to level 5. Now, the first stage of soul activation is all about self-expression. So if you have difficulties, beliefs which make it difficult for you to survive, or you live in a situation where it's difficult to survive, then it will be really difficult for you to activate the self-expression part. If you have limiting beliefs around relationships, when it comes to the second stage of soul activation in level 6, which is all about connecting, you can have difficulties connecting. And at the third stage of ego development, which is about being recognized in your peer group and feeling confident, if you had difficulties there and had limiting beliefs, it'd be really hard for you to contribute at the seventh stage of development. And so there are these linkages between ego development and soul development. But the most important point I want to make here is that we really have to rejig completely our education system to recognize that our children going through those first three stages of development are preparing themselves to be fully activated souls. And so we need to teach our children to express themselves, teach them how to connect in loving relationships, and teach them how to contribute to their peers around them. If you can build an education system based on self-expression, connection, and contribution, rather than being successful in our three-dimensional material world and learning a hell of a lot of stuff that isn't useful to us, that would change. That would really lead to what you have spent most of your life thinking about, and that's heaven on earth.
Yeah, I'm hearing that very clearly. Richard, I want to move to have you speak a little bit about the 7 levels in relationships and organizations. Actually, let me tell you what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how the 7 levels, if you could just not go into huge detail, but how it applies to relationships, organizations, countries. And then I want to speak about how it would apply to us as humanity, as a collective. So a little bit on relationships, organizations, and country. Start with relationships.
Well, Martin, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to start with countries. Why? Because that's exactly what came to my mind. So, Martin, I hope you don't mind. Will you forgive me?
You're forgiven.
Thank you. We all remember the Arab Spring. Okay, so what was going on in the Arab Spring? Well, this is what was going on. Let's talk about Egypt. There was a significant number of people in their early 20s, late 20s, and early 30s that were differentiated and were individuating because they managed to meet all their lower order needs, the deficiency needs, as Maslow called them, and were now at that integrating stage looking for freedom, autonomy to be who they really were. That's what was happening culturally. They were hitting up against an authoritarian regime that didn't want them to have the freedom of expression and the autonomy that they needed. And this was exactly the same thing that happened in the USSR, which is currently in North Korea and quite a bit in China. The so-called dissidents that these countries talk about are simply people who are individuating and self-actualizing. They're wanting freedom, autonomy, and they're wanting to express who they really are, but they're living inside a cultural regime that cannot tolerate people being independent and expressing their needs, because it's a fearful regime operating at level 3 consciousness. So you see how all that fits together. So if you're living so here's another aspect of that. If you're living in a liberal democracy and your parents were self-actualized individuals, you get a phenomenon which we can see quite clearly called the millennials. These people grew up without any fear during the first 3 levels of consciousness because they're living in a liberal democracy and they're not living in poverty, and they're born to self-actualized parents who are encouraging them to express who they are. And this basically, these are the millennials who are living in liberal democracies. Now, just because you were born in a particular age group doesn't mean you're a millennial. For example, most of the ISIS fighters are also millennials, if you just take age. But no, millennial is really somebody who has been brought up in a liberal democracy, had self-actualized parents, and has grown up without too many fears, and therefore is moving through these stages of development very easily. They still have to pass through all the stages, but they're doing it in a very comfortable way without having to rebel too much, etc., etc. So that's how all that fits together in nations. Now, briefly in organizations, most of the for-profit organizations that we have operate from the first 3 levels of consciousness, and many of them have limiting beliefs and limiting values like bureaucracy, blame, internal competition, etc., etc. Well, we can measure that, and cultural entropy is the proportion of values which are potentially limiting in a cultural values assessment. So many of our for-profit organizations are operating in those ego levels. Maybe they've just got to the 4th level, whereas the people that they're employing tend to be operating at a slightly higher level. And so they feel that their needs are not met, and they feel a lack of engagement with the organization because their needs are not met. They're operating at a higher level than the organization. Now, there are some organizations, let's call them not-for-profits or NGOs, who tend to be operating at the higher levels of consciousness. They want to make a difference. Everybody's looking for meaning and purpose and service. Well, very often the problem with those organizations is that they haven't focused on the first 3 levels, which are about survival, relationship, and self-esteem. They're not very good at productivity. They're not even very good at relationships, and nobody was paying any attention to the money rolling in. So they're really shooting themselves in the foot by the fact that they're not operating at all levels of consciousness. And so that's the key for a successful organization, be it a for-profit or not-for-profit, to have a spectrum of values across all 7 levels. That's what I call a full-spectrum organization. That's what I call a full-spectrum individual. And that is really how to live our lives as individuals and as organizations.
Very clear, very clear. I'd never gotten the notion of full spectrum before. I don't think I've ever heard you say that in my interactions with you, but it makes total sense. Total sense. Move with me now, if you would, to humanity. Have you thought about the 7 levels with respect to us, the human family?
Yes. So the the problem that we have to overcome as humanity is that we grow up in cultural containers which we call nations. And each nation, as a cultural container, has been evolving at a different pace. And so where Saudi Arabia is not where France is, and where France is not where USA is. So every nation operates at different levels of consciousness, and it's due to the history, and it's due to the history of the evolution of their consciousness. So even in Africa, even the word nation really doesn't mean anything, because in Africa, people belong to tribes. They don't belong to nations. Nations are a false way of allocating people to space. People didn't, the colonialists just drew straight lines, and they may have gone right through the middle of tribal lands or not. But so my point is that these containers, these cultural containers, are all evolving at a different pace. People in Scandinavia, for example, and particularly Sweden, are probably the most evolved in many ways at community living, most evolved people on the planet. Now, at a personal level, you could say, well, people living in Bhutan are the most evolved. Yes, they are, because nearly everybody embraces the Buddhist tradition, and the nation there, I measured it as a very, very low level of cultural entropy. So in many ways, they are evolved, but in terms of living in community, I would say Scandinavia is also very evolved too. Anyhow, so let me get to the point, your point. The thing you have to remember that every single human being is an individuated aspect of the universal energy field. And that universal energy field is humanity. There is a part of it which is humanity. We all share in that humanity. At the 4th level of energetic consciousness, we're all aspects of that universal energy field. And we all share the same values at that level. There is one true self. We are all aspects of that one true self. And so as you move into those higher stages of development, your ability to connect and contribute increase and increase and increase. So you get to the point where when you realize that when I give to you, I'm giving to myself, because we're both individuated aspects of that universal energy field. And so that is really that's where we're heading to. How quickly we're going to get there, I don't know. There's still a few decades, if not millennia, to go through before we come to that realization. But look where we've come from. We've come a long way in the past few thousand years. And the pace of evolution of consciousness is accelerating. And some people argue that the pace of evolution is accelerating because the problems that we're experiencing are becoming more and more universal, and we have to get together in order to resolve that problem, or those problems. The problems of existence are global, but the methods we have for dealing with them are national. And since all nations operate at different levels of consciousness, no wonder it's really hard for us to resolve these global problems when you've got a whole diversity of consciousness. The Economic Intelligence Unit have a way of measuring democracy, and there are basically, according to them, there are only 26 full democracies, although there are quite a number of other countries that consider themselves to be democracies, but they're not in the Economic Intelligence Unit's eyes, full democracies like Russia, for example. They're not really fully democracies. Actually, frankly, I don't believe the USA or the UK are full democracies, because both democracies have been hijacked by the elites, by the powerful business elites in the USA and by the powerful establishment in the UK. We have a long way to go to evolve these crucibles of consciousness, and that's why the work of measuring consciousness in nations is so important. And one of the things that really I find intriguing is that we've actually measured the values of Saudi Arabia. Some people highly placed in that country came to us, asked us to train their people, and have mapped the values of Saudi Arabia. So they're now looking at what people's personal values are, the values they see in the nation, and the values they'd like to see in the nation. That says to me there's significant hope. But that's, I think, the key. We have to evolve the consciousness of our communities and nations if we're ever going to get to a palpable recognition of humanity.
You know, we just have a couple of minutes left, Richard. In this last section that you just spoke to, what I was left with was a sense of hope, a sense of grandeur with respect to the vista that you see for the human journey. And I see some of the leverage points, as in communities and nations, that by applying your work and the work that many, many others are doing, the Shift Network for sure, we're raising that consciousness. And so your work gives me hope, Richard. Thank you. And I wanted to just, in the time left, this would be a good time for you to let our listeners know. You spoke earlier about free personal value tests they could take online. How can they do that?
Go to valuescentre.com/PVA, as in personal values assessment. Values Center, spelled the European way, .com/PVA. You pick out values, you get the results in about 2 minutes. Also, if you want to find out more about what I'm up to, you can go to richardbarrett.net. That's BARETT, Richard Barrett, one word, .net. And if you want to find out about my latest book and the workshops I'm doing around that, you can go to richardbarrett.net/E, S, D. And I think that's enough, because when you get to my website, everything's there. You know, there's so much to choose from. You could be happy for several evenings.
Give that little, the acronym was CE, richardbarrett.net/ESD,
Ego Soul Dynamics.
Ego Soul Dynamic. Wonderful. Final thoughts, Richard. I wanted to ask you my three Heaven on Earth questions. Recall a time when you experienced heaven on earth. What was that?
I don't have to recall it. I'm experiencing it right now with you.
Thank you. And imagine you have a magic wand, and with it can have heaven on earth. What's heaven on earth for you?
Heaven on earth is a community of souls who no longer have any fear in their lives.
A community of souls who no longer have any fear in their lives. And if, assuming, which I do, no fear in their lives, what's present?
Love. Love. Love.
Yep. I would say that's what you are, Richard. Your commitment to humanity is very clear, very clear. Thank you. Is there one thing you'd like to leave our listeners with? One final thing as a next step they could take to make some changes in their own lives, in addition to going and getting the personal values assessment tool?
I would say listen to Martin Root. Martin Root has been following this idea of heaven on earth ever since I've known him. He has never let it alone for a single minute. And I think, Martin, you are doing your bit to create heaven on earth, just as I'm doing my little bit to create heaven on earth. And so are many other souls listening in to this program.
Wonderful. So what I take away from that, first of all, is a lovely acknowledgement, thank you, but also an invitation to people to discover what their soul is here for and to do that. And that, for me personally, is their contribution, will be their contribution to heaven on earth. Richard, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, Martin, it's always great hanging out with you.
Thank you for joining us for Co-Creating Heaven on Earth, brought to you by the Shift Network. To add this powerful collection of teachings to your personal library, visit heavenonearthsummit.com and click Upgrade. To learn more about our global community of people awakening to their divine humanity and taking inspired action, visit theshiftnetwork.com. We're grateful for your support and for sharing this life-changing information with your friends and family.